for members' business. Other motions? Notice of motion number 1 on JAW Gardner to move.
Member for Morialta.
So it's with great pleasure that I rise to move the motion standing in my name. This is a motion that relates to the Year 1 Phonics check and the application of evidence-based measures to support our youngest learners in school in the development of their literacy capabilities. Learning to read is one of the most foundational aspects of all education. It's not the only aspect of education. Ensuring that our children's developmental needs are considered, ensuring our children are attending school, ensuring that children have access to a broad range of curriculum that will energise their interests, will excite them, will give them opportunities to learn, to flourish, to thrive, and find pathways to meaningful life outcomes. We want our education system to enable every young South Australian to be their best selves, to fulfil their potential. But, sir, unless you effectively teach our children, to read, all of those other aspects of their education are either diminished or rendered incapable, certainly incapable of being fulfilled to their potential. And unfortunately, sir, we have understanding in South Australia, this most prosperous of jurisdictions by world and historical comparisons, a jurisdiction when certainly there was a period where we were not putting our most effective resources towards this important goal of teaching our children and young people to read. It's no one specific person's fault. We each of us, as we go about our business, whether as politicians or teachers or any other aspect of society, we each of us have an opportunity every day to learn how to do things better, to use the evidence that we are given to best apply ourselves to whatever trade we are seeking to accomplish. Unfortunately, when it came to teaching kids to read, for 20 or 30 years, maybe even 40 years, the prevailing wisdom in academia was that a whole language approach to the teaching of reading was more effective than looking at the evidence. And what was seen as old-fashioned in the 1960s and 70s, and indeed ancient history in the 80s and 90s in our universities, that being the teaching of phonics to children, to be able to decode language and be able to read the words that are in front of them, even if they were words that they had not previously encountered, even if they were words that were not accompanied by a picture that might give a clue or a cue as to how that word should be pronounced. That was the prevailing wisdom, and unfortunately we have had a couple of generations of people going through universities not being given the best evidence base. So when I was appointed Shadow Minister for Education in 2016, I was approached by a number of people. I sought a significant number of stakeholders' time as to how we could best help our children to get better outcomes. Because in that year, in 2016, in our NAPLAN results, and I recognise NAPLAN isn't the be-all and end-all, it is a snapshot in time, but it is a very useful snapshot in understanding how a system goes. And our NAPLAN results had South Australia students drifting backwards from the pack. Now, there are always reasons why a child might not prosper or might not thrive. But on year-on-year NAPLAN assessments, when every jurisdiction in Australia is undertaking the same test, and you see South Australia's results diminishing year-on-year, and diminishing compared to other states year-on-year, as we were through the period from when I entered Parliament in 2010 up until 2016, when I became Shadow Minister for Education, you must ask yourself the question, why is this the case? Are we doing the best for our children, such as they deserve? And the answer very simply, sir, was no, we were not. We were failing our children by failing to adopt the most effective evidence-based techniques to teach them to read. South Australia students consequently, I think it was 2016, where we were last or second last in 16 out of the 20 categories for which NAPLAN was tested. We were behind Tasmania in a lot of these categories of all the states. I don't count the territories because of the small numbers that we're talking about there. But South Australia was not doing well enough. Now, the Code Red Dyslexia Network, people like Sandra Marshall from Dyslexia SA, people from SPELD, an outstanding organisation that still continues to this day from their institution some 40 or 50 years ago. SPELD for an organisation that advocates for and also offers interventions to and supports government in its work for children with specific learning difficulties. People at that time like Kathy Wilson, who was a former principal at Stradbroke Primary in my local area and a chair of SPELD. People like Sandy Russo, who was a senior figure in SPELD at the time and is now a learning intervention coach and tutor in my local area in Ross Trevor. Stakeholders such as these, but also a number of others, highlighted the need for us to ensure that there was a rigorous and consistent approach to the use of phonics across our schools in South Australia. Because unless we did that, then we were failing our children. But they also highlighted consistently to me that the prevailing wisdom, despite the fact that academic research was increasingly showing that the science of learning, the science of reading and evidence-based explicit instruction in the early years when it came to particularly aspects of teaching children to read using approaches like synthetic phonics was the most effective way to teach all children to read, especially for those with dyslexia and other learning difficulties. But despite that, many of the teachers who, of course, had come through had never been effectively trained in it. Schools were often purchasing programs that would have a program, and some of them very good programs, but unless taught effectively and rigorously, were not having the desired impacts on students. I heard from SPELD that they were regularly called into schools to help them try and pick up their reading instruction, and they might have been using a phonics-based program but not using it well, and they were finding they had to teach the teachers how to use the programs. And in the meanwhile, in the UK, we had a situation where the English government, the UK government, but bearing in mind that Westminster has specific responsibility for England's schooling system, not the devolved Scottish, Welsh and Northern Ireland systems. In England, one of the aspects that was promoted to me by SPELD and by Dyslexia SA was this Year 1 phonics check. A Year 1 phonics check which was a marker that would help particularly students, teachers in their classroom activity, help principals, leaders, and indeed the teachers themselves to understand where a child was placed at in their phonics, and would also be a signpost for systems, policymakers, and those who are interested observers, journalists, and the like, such as the good folk we have in our South Australian press corps. They were signposts into how systems were going in teaching our youngest learners, because of course by the time a student's Year 3 NAPLAN results come about, if they are identifying that a student is falling short in reading, the student is already 8 years old, has already been at school for 3.5 years. In many cases, certainly 2.5 years. And indeed, that is quite a late time to be starting an intervention that could be readily identified much earlier. In the UK, in England, when they started this phonics check, in the first year of results, the results were very poor, and that acted as a signpost for the system to improve their results. And indeed, over the subsequent decade, those results had improved. And what followed consequently, and not just as a result of phonics becoming the dominant methodology for teaching little children to read, but also through a rigorous evidence-based approach to the rest of curricula and the rest of teaching across English schools, the international rankings, which again are a moment in time, a snapshot, but a very useful one, saw England's education system having diminished from the top 5 and top 10 across reading and maths some 20 years ago. It had diminished into the 20s and the 30s. It turned around. And again, after 10 years of phonics, and as it is now, back in the top 5 and back in the top 10 according to those measures. I thought it was really important we have that opportunity in South Australia. And we developed a suite of measures. We called it our Literacy Guarantee suite of measures, which we announced and took to the 2018 election. Stephen Marshall had an ambition for South Australia to have the best schools in Australia. As I said many times as Minister, we wanted every child in every classroom, no matter what suburb or town or city they lived in South Australia, to have the best opportunity to thrive, to succeed in life, to fulfil their potential. And getting the basics right in those early years is absolutely critical. It included literacy coaches, who indeed, through that Literacy Guarantee Unit, have been providing direct coaching to teachers in schools, particularly where there is a deficit. It included school holiday programs, opportunities for teachers to upgrade their own professional development. It included the Year 1 Phonics check, which I was very, very pleased to again thank Nick Gibb when I spoke to him at a Centre for Independent Studies conference recently a few weeks ago when he was visiting Australia, to thank him for the way that the English government, the UK government, had provided their cheque free of charge to South Australia to be able to adapt and use for our local needs. And indeed, it also included a range of other metrics. One of the things that the Education Department did that worked really well was providing resources to schools, identifying best practice, helping those principals, Year 1 teachers, and indeed, even better when you had a whole school approach with buy-in from all of the teachers into it. It enabled them to upgrade the way in which they were doing their work. Now, when we first implemented this, there was a trial that was conducted in 2017 at 50 schools, and I have previously and will again commend the Deputy Premier, the former Minister for Education, for implementing that trial. It was very complimentary and enabled us to move more quickly on our policy, probably improved the speed of it by 6 months to 12 months in how we were able to then roll it out. Because the findings of that trial, through some Flinders University research by Anne Bayeto, amongst others, was able to identify a couple of adjustments to the English check that worked well for South Australian standards. That trial was then able to be adapted into a full rollout, which we committed to in March 2017, or May 2017, and I'll also acknowledge that Labor committed to 2 days before that 2018 election to doing the same. And for what it's worth, James Sadler and the Xenophon party that were running at that time had made that same commitment in between. So we have full bipartisan support for this approach now in South Australia, and that approach over the last 6 years has helped back up the work of principals in schools who have helped get teachers on board. When we had the first check in 2018 in all schools, it's fair to say that a significant number of our teachers were sceptical. The union was sceptical. A large number of people, of course, had been applying their trade as they were taught in university, and they believed themselves to be doing the very best possible job. And it's completely understandable they would feel that way. Many were surprised to discover a lower proportion of their students meeting the standard than they had expected. And across South Australia, 43% only of our Year 1 students met that standard in the first years. 45% in metropolitan area, 36% in country. Only 18% in low SES communities. 21% in Aboriginal communities, and 14% for students with a disability. It was a wake-up call for them, and many responded in a way that made me so proud to be the Minister for Education at the time. They looked for ways that they could do better. They took on board the training that was being offered. And what we have been seeing since is these whole school approaches, not just the phonics check and the interventions that it therefore has allowed, but also indeed the way that whole schools across South Australia have changed their approach to the teaching of literacy. And over subsequent years, we had a 9% improvement in the first year, another 11% in the second year, and we've gone over the 6 years of the checks up to last year from 43% to 71% of our students achieving the benchmark. Even more impressive is the improvement in low SES communities from 18% to 47%. Aboriginal communities, 21% improved to 44%, and students with disability improving from 14% to 45%. What that demonstrates is the students who are benefiting the most are actually the ones whose need was the most acute. And that benefit is something of which we can be proud. There is always more work to do. It cannot be assumed that because the Year 1 phonics check and the work that's been done to improve the teaching of reading for our Year 1s has improved, that is the end of the story. The government has recently introduced a numeracy check. It's a logical next step to do so, and I look forward to getting a briefing on how that numeracy check is working and whether it is exactly the right model, but it was always going to be the logical next step. The UK government followed its phonics check with a times tables check. The South Australian government has followed followed the phonics check with a numeracy check, and we will work with the government in a bipartisan way to fashion the best possible future way forward for that, I'm sure. It is also worth noting, though, that there are a range of challenges that the system confronts. Our NAPLAN results, having had that low point in 2016, were the fastest improving in the nation between 2017 and 2022. We overtook Tasmania, we overtook Queensland, we were catching up to Western Australia and everything other than Year 9, where they put significant stakes on their NAPLAN tests. We plateaued, I think it's fair to say, this year. So I think we'll be really interested to see what the 2024 phonics checks show. But most of all, I want to congratulate all of the educators, the support staff, the parents and the children for the work they've done in their reading and learning this year. I'm sure those phonics checks will be good, and I look forward to seeing the work that these young people and their educators do in the months and years ahead, because with a great education, they can achieve anything.